Step into the world of Rick Rypien, an undersized NHL enforcer who defied expectations with every punch he threw, every shift he skated, and every skeptical whisper he proved wrong. He was the heart of the team whenever he took the ice, a loyal fighter on the boards, an endless reservoir of energy, and an inspiration to countless fans who saw in his eyes a blazing spirit that refused to be dimmed by odds. Yet behind the roar of the stadium and the bright lights that followed him, Rypien fought a battle invisible to most. His was a silent struggle that even the closest people in his orbit sometimes only glimpsed. This is a story of raw courage, devastating loss, and a legacy that transcends the sport of hockey. It is a story that reminds us how grit comes not just from fists and checks, but also from facing inner storms that few dare to name out loud. Today we look beyond the tough exterior, past the headlines and the highlight reels, to see what it really means to stand your ground, both in the arena and within yourself. Rick Rypien was born on May 16, 1984, in the small town of Coleman, Alberta, tucked away in the rugged landscape of southwestern Canada. From an early age, nature and circumstance conspired to shape him. In that part of the country, hockey wasn't merely a pastime. It was woven into the daily life of small communities, frozen ponds, local rinks, and the communal pride of cheering on promising youths offered both a social anchor and a stage. Rick, small in stature even as a child, found in these surroundings a place to test himself. He would play hour after hour, braving frigid temperatures that would make most kids call it quits. As local legends have it, he once even shoveled off his own makeshift rink in a vacant patch of land, determined not to let the winter elements slow his development. He was encouraged by a supportive family, people who saw the same spark in him that would eventually captivate professional scouts. Though the population of Coleman hovered in the lower thousands, the sense of community often made up for a lack of big city resources. People rallied around youth sports, and neighbors sometimes chipped in to buy equipment or to help maintain the local rink. Rick took advantage of every opportunity. By the time he hit his teenage years, he was already known in local circles as the player whose passion outstripped his size, a young forward with quick hands, a surprising burst of speed, and a willingness to hustle after every puck, no matter what. Yet even as he transitioned to more competitive leagues, Rick stood out not just for his skill, but for his toughness. He was never afraid to play physical hockey, delivering hits on players who outweighed him, battling in corners where bigger bodies usually dominated. That willingness to engage physically, coupled with an innate fearlessness, turned heads. If he lost a battle, he'd pick himself up and charge in for more. If he got hit, he learned to hit back. In this era of Canadian junior hockey, fighting and grit were currency, and Rick quickly accrued a wealth of both. But scouts often prioritize two main attributes: size and draft status. And in these categories, Rick faced skepticism. He was a modest 5'11", sometimes officially listed at 5'10", hovering between 170 and 180 pounds, depending on the season and circumstances. For an NHL hopeful who dreamt of being an enforcer, or at least a physical presence, that profile wasn't easy to market. Skeptics would see his height, check a box labeled undersized, and move on. The draft came and went without Rick's name being called. In a league that loves prototypical measurements, 6 feet 2 inches, 220 pounds, Rick's intangible qualities were overlooked. Still, the Regina Pats of the Western Hockey League, WHL, saw something special. They offered him a chance, giving Rick a proving ground in a tough junior league known for a blend of skill and raw physicality. And he delivered. He wasn't just playing the game, he was leaving an impression. He'd line up against larger opponents every night, often the big guys who believed they could bully him, only to watch him stand his ground. Fans noticed how he'd elevate the energy of the bench by fearlessly mixing it up along the boards or dropping the gloves when challenged. Opponents learned that underestimating this short player could mean a punch to the jaw and a humiliating trip to the penalty box. By the end of his time in Regina, Rick had earned a reputation for hustle and courage. Coaches described him as the kind of player who, despite his smaller stature, found a way to dominate pivotal moments. He'd crash the net, jump in to defend a teammate, or lay an open ice hit that defied logic. Scouts from various NHL organizations eventually circled back, curious about the relentless drive behind this kid who had been ignored in the draft. Among them, the Vancouver Canucks organization sensed that intangible fire and decided to take a chance on him. Rick's path to the NHL was never straightforward. He joined the Manitoba Moose, Vancouver's American Hockey League (AHL) affiliate, on a tryout basis, determined to scratch and claw his way to a contract. Day after day, practice after practice, he outworked guys who had been drafted in higher rounds, guys who had the pedigree he lacked. He fought in scrimmages, sacrificed his body to block shots, and chipped in offensively whenever he could. Coaches took note. During intra-squad games or preseason matchups, Rypien would stand toe-to-toe with players who dwarfed him, refusing to back down. Fans of the Moose embraced him as a folk hero, this scrappy underdog who, night after night, didn't just survive on the ice, but thrived. Eventually, the Canucks offered him a proper deal, bringing him up as an injury call-up for the NHL roster. When Rick first stepped on NHL ice, some questioned whether his high-tempo, bruising style would translate. Could an AHL success story hold his own among the bigger, faster competition in the world's premier league? It didn't take long for him to answer. In his initial call-ups, Rick dropped the gloves against more seasoned enforcers, winning over Vancouver's fans with his single-minded determination. His name might not have been well known around the league, but in Vancouver, the local faithful were soon chanting for him. Night after night, Rick carved out a reputation as an undersized forward who could shift the game's momentum in a single shift. He'd charge the net, hound the puck carrier, and if an opponent laid a dirty hit on a Canuck, Rick was there, fists clenched, eyes blazing. It was the kind of hockey that made highlight reels and post-game news stories, an unheralded enforcer standing toe-to-toe with the league's giants and, often, sending them reeling. Fans latched onto that narrative of a guy who had to fight for every inch he gained in professional hockey. In a city that cherished passionate, high-effort players, Rick's underdog story was an instant hit. Behind that public persona, though, Rypien was coping with something far more sinister than an on-ice rival. From an early age, Rick had struggled with his mental health, battling depression that seemed to intensify as the stakes grew higher. Hockey became both an escape and an amplifier. He loved the game, but the spotlight, the pressure, and the revolving door of expectations could make his invisible fight all the more suffocating. He tried to hide it, confiding in a few close friends or family members, but rarely speaking openly. Even among teammates, the conversation was minimal, partly because hockey culture often taught players to tough it out. As the years went on, Rypien's mental health war escalated. He took leaves of absence from the Canucks that were only vaguely explained to the press as personal reasons. The rumor mill churned. Some speculated about nagging physical injuries. Others whispered about personal struggles. In locker rooms, the code of silence around mental health meant that even if teammates suspected something deeper, they often didn't know how to approach it. A bruise or a broken bone was straightforward. You taped it, iced it, maybe sat out a few games. But depression wasn't something you could just patch up and keep playing. Vancouver fans, unaware of the full story, mostly welcomed Rick back each time with cheers, grateful to see him bring that fiery style of hockey they adored. He would jump into a fight a few minutes into his return, invigorate the bench, and it seemed like everything was fine. But depression doesn't just vanish because you're on a hot streak or because the crowd adores you. The cycle continued, short bursts of triumphant returns, followed by absences that nobody could fully understand. A sense of foreboding lingered in the background, even if many outsiders couldn't quite put their finger on it. What makes Rick's story so poignant is the duality of his existence. Unstoppable on the ice, yet silently imploding off it. In a broader sense, it underscores a clash between hockey's valorization of toughness and the harsh reality of mental illness. The NHL in the 2000s still viewed physical enforcers as essential components. Even with the league's slow pivot towards skill and speed, fights remained a spectacle that drew roars from the stands. Many enforcers, already under pressure to keep their roster spots by fighting, faced additional emotional burdens, battling not just opponents, but inner turmoil. Some in the game have speculated that this environment, combined with personal predispositions, can turn tragic for those who struggle with mental health. In 2011, Rick signed with the Winnipeg Jets, a new organization, yet a familiar environment in some ways. The franchise had connections to the Manitoba Moose, where Rick had found his footing and a supportive crowd. It was supposed to be a fresh start in a city that already admired him, But just weeks after inking the deal, on August 15, 2011, the devastating news broke. Rick Rypien had taken his own life at his home, shocking the hockey world. He was only 27 years old. In an instant, the conversation about mental health in hockey shifted from hushed whispers to the forefront of media attention. Fans, teammates, and league officials asked the same haunting questions. How could this happen? Could we have done something more? In the emotional aftermath, Vancouver Canucks personnel publicly spoke of Rick's long-standing battle with depression. They expressed heartbreak, acknowledging that they had tried to support him, but the scope of his pain was deeper than many realized. Tributes poured in from around the league. Opponents who once fought him in the corners or traded punches at center ice now offered words of respect. Journalists wrote eulogies that described him as the ultimate underdog fighter, a testament to the idea that heart can triumph over physical limitations. Yet overshadowing these accolades was an immense sadness that a young man so full of competitive fire, so beloved by fans and peers alike, felt his only escape was to end his life. To fully absorb Rick Rypien's impact, we need to look at the broader context of enforcers in the NHL around that time. The early 2000s and 10s were a grim period for hockey tough guys. Derek Boogaard died of an accidental overdose in 2011. Wade Baylock took his own life later that summer. Suddenly, the tough guys who had once been lauded for their fists were appearing in obituaries and fueling debates about the physical and mental toll of the enforcer role. While the correlation between fighting, concussions, substance abuse, and depression is complicated, the conversation forced people to rethink. Sports radio shows, hockey analysts, and fans asked, is the enforcer role inherently dangerous beyond the injuries we see on the surface? Rypien's passing became a flashpoint for teams and the NHL to address mental health more proactively. The Vancouver Canucks played a leading role in initiating public discussions, launching mental health awareness programs like mindcheck.ca, aimed at youth who struggled with depression or anxiety. The idea was simple. If Rick's story could save even one life, or encourage one young fan to seek help, his legacy would be more than just a string of memorable fights. The campaign was embraced by the hockey community, and it eventually evolved, partnering with mental health charities to continue the mission. In the months and years that followed, there was a gradual shift in how mental health was addressed within professional hockey. Teams started providing more resources to players, counselors, psychological services, educational seminars about stress management. While it wasn't a perfect transformation, it opened a door that had long been locked. Players began to see that speaking up about anxiety or depression didn't necessarily mean their careers were over. It's an ongoing culture shift, but Rick's story played a crucial role in nudging that shift forward. On the ice, Rick's hockey legacy remains that of a tenacious, undersized spark plug who refused to be intimidated. Fans still recall specific fights where he took on opponents who seemed twice his size, men with more significant reputations as bruisers, and either held his own or outright won. They recall the bench jumping to its feet, cheering as their smaller teammate bested a bigger rival in a test of wills and fists. They remember the roars from the stands when Rypien's name was announced, for even those who disapproved of the more violent aspects of hockey found themselves admiring the purity of his heart. Yet off the ice, his narrative transcends the highlight reels. It's about the nature of courage in a sport that defines it in terms of grit and physical sacrifice, but has too often overlooked emotional vulnerability. His struggle illustrates how fighting through pain can be both literal and metaphorical, and how the latter kind of fight often takes place far from the cheering crowds. In that sense, Rypien's life story stands as a stark reminder that we must expand our understanding of what toughness really means. Toughness can be about throwing a big hit or winning a fight, but it can also be about admitting you're losing a battle in your mind and seeking help. Memories of Rick often circle back to seemingly mundane details. How he was quiet in the locker room unless someone needed encouragement. How he'd sometimes vanish after games, choosing solitude over going out. Teammates mention instances where they suspected he wasn't doing well, but didn't quite know how to help or what to say. Part of his legacy, then, is a plea for better awareness. Athletes are trained to be physically strong, but emotional strength sometimes requires admitting your weakness, sharing your battles with those around you, and leaning on the people who care. If there's any silver lining, it's that Rypien's tragic end spurred a reevaluation of that dynamic in professional hockey. From a tactical standpoint, analyzing Rick's game reveals the blueprint for a specialized fourth-line role that can make or break a team's morale. He wasn't a prolific scorer, but he brought energy on the forecheck, disruptiveness in front of the net, and a willingness to stand up for teammates. Coaches often praised his situational awareness, knowing precisely when to inject aggression. He'd rarely take a mindless penalty. Rather, his fights often seemed tactical, designed to jolt the bench awake at a pivotal moment. This aspect made him more than just a sideshow enforcer. He was a multi-dimensional contributor who, in the right circumstances, could spark a comeback. It's easy to romanticize the enforcer role with words like warrior or gladiator, but the reality is more nuanced. Enforcers live in a strange paradox. They're tasked with protecting their teammates and lifting the crowd, yet they themselves often endure loneliness and high stress. Fans see them as icons of bravery, but that bravery can isolate them from expressing fear or vulnerability. Rick's trajectory underscores that tension. At times, he seemed unstoppable, the poster child for hockey's brand of unstoppable grit. But in quieter moments, he was grappling with doubts and darkness that few suspected were so severe. When you talk to those who knew Rick personally, coaches, friends, family, they'll emphasize that he was more than just a hockey player. He had a sense of humor, a fondness for pranks, and a generosity that extended off the ice. He'd visit children in hospitals, volunteer for youth clinics, and donate time or gear to local charities. That side of him rarely made headlines. It's overshadowed by the fabled fights and the tragic end. Yet, it's a core part of understanding the man behind the persona. The same passion that drove him to battle bigger foes on the ice also fueled a compassion for others, especially for kids who reminded him of his younger self. Looking back, it's tempting to wonder if the story could have ended differently, if an intervention of the right kind, at the right moment, might have turned the tide. That question haunts many who loved or admired Rick. But we don't get to rewrite that chapter. What we can do is ensure that his life and death feed into a broader conversation about mental health. His story, layered as it is with triumph and despair, can continue sparking empathy in a sport that still grapples with how to handle these issues. By talking openly about his experiences, we keep alive the message that mental health struggles can touch anyone, no matter how strong or fearless they appear.